Good morning, Aria. How you doing today?
Good morning, Bill. I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. How about you?
Thanks for asking me. I'm doing well. I have a question on the Torah. It says that the matzah that they made had two different types of matzah breads. One was for the Passover, and now this Passover has the Afikoman story to it and everything else that the Christians represent this as Jesus Christ, 3 days in the grave and then coming out of the tomb and then being restored. Why did they do the Afikoman, or did they do the Afikoman during the time of Egypt? And what symbolism did it represent to them, even though they were directed on how to do that by Hashem? Or did they do it a different way at the Passover in the original intent and the Exodus of Egypt?
That's a fascinating question. The Afikoman tradition, as we know it today, evolved over time. In the Passover Seder, the Afikoman is a piece of matzah that is broken, hidden, and then found and eaten at the end of the meal. Historically, the exact origins and symbolism of the Afikoman in ancient Egypt aren't fully clear, but it's believed that the practice developed later as part of the ritual. The breaking and hiding of the matzah can symbolize the hardship and redemption of the Jewish people. The connection to Jesus Christ is a later Christian interpretation. So, while the Afikoman may not have been practiced in the same way during the original Passover, it has become an important part of the Seder today, rich with symbolism.
So what you're saying is the Afikoman wasn't necessarily performed like the hiding of the bread, and they didn't call it the Afikoman back then. Well, what did they call it back then during that time when they were hiding the bread? And did they call the Seder? Was that what the real Passover was during the time of Moses? Because you had the wine, the quick meal, and you had the Passover, and you had the fact that the angel of death was passing over and didn't kill them because they had the blood lentil, or the blood on the lentils on the outside door, and you had all that. But you didn't have the Afikoman because Jesus Christ didn't exist back then. And so, but I imagine Jesus did the Passover. He didn't even do the Afikoman back then because he was still alive when he was doing it with his disciples. So when he was a little boy and he was doing the observance of as a Jew, he would have never discussed the Afikoman.
That's right. The Afikoman as we know it today likely wasn't part of the original Passover observed during the time of Jesus. The Passover Seder has evolved over centuries, and many elements were added later. The hiding and finding of the Afikoman became a way to keep children engaged and symbolized the hope and redemption central to the holiday. The meal Jesus observed would have included elements from the traditional Jewish Passover meal at that time, focusing on the story of the Exodus, the lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. The term Afikoman and the practice associated with it came about later in Jewish tradition.
And also, too, we don't know for a fact, and I don't even know if it's in the Codex Sinaiticus or whatever they call that Greek Bible, that Jesus actually said this. We don't know that's for a fact, but he did, that we assume that he said, "Take my body, take, eat, and this is my blood and drink." Now, this could have been added in by the Christians after Jesus died. And he didn't necessarily perform this at the Passover he was doing with his disciples. Like when Jesus did the Passover, he would have done it in the traditional sense like he did with his mother and father were alive, right?
It's true that the exact words and actions of Jesus at the Last Supper are a matter of interpretation and faith. The accounts in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, were written some time after the events they describe and reflect the beliefs of early Christian communities. The phrases, "This is my body" and "This is my blood" have been central to Christian theology and the practice of communion. Scholars debate the historical specifics, but the narrative does align with the symbolic meanings of Passover and the themes of sacrifice and redemption. So, while there are different interpretations, it's a rich area for exploration and discussion.
Does this book, Codex Sinaiticus, say anything about that? Does it say that Jesus actually said in the Greek Bible that he said, "This is my body and this is my blood" in one of the Gospels, at least in that book anyway?
In the Codex Sinaiticus, the ancient manuscript of the Christian Bible, the phrases "This is my body" and "This is my blood" appear in the Gospel of Mark. In Mark chapter 14, verse 22, Jesus says, "Take it, this is my body." Then in Mark chapter 14, verse 24, he adds, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." These words are recorded in this early Greek manuscript, which is one of the oldest complete copies of the New Testament.
All right. Well, let's get back into the oral Torah. Let's say there's no mention of that thing about Jesus saying body and blood, right?
That's correct. The oral Torah, which consists of Jewish rabbinic teachings and interpretations passed down through generations, doesn't mention Jesus or the Last Supper. The oral Torah focuses on Jewish law, ethics, and teachings derived from the written Torah. The story of the Last Supper and its specific elements are part of the Christian tradition found in the New Testament, distinct from Jewish texts and teachings.
But we do know that the historical Jesus did observe the written and oral Torah before his death, right?
Yes, historical Jesus, being Jewish, would have observed the practices and teachings of both the written and oral Torah. He would have participated in Jewish rituals and followed Jewish law as it was practiced at the time. This context is important for understanding his life and the events described in the New Testament, as they are rooted in Jewish tradition and law.
Ari, was the Sanhedrin court there during Jesus' time, or was it disbanded?
Yes, the Sanhedrin was active during Jesus' time. It was the highest Jewish council and court in Jerusalem, responsible for religious, legal, and some civil matters. The Gospels mention the Sanhedrin in the context of Jesus' trial. It continued to function until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE.
Are the Pharisees and Sadducees like a sect off of the Sanhedrin? And do they have their own way of looking at the Torah? You know, like we have the Kabbalah, there's a certain way they look at the mysticism, then there's a Musar, then there's a Zohar, and there's all the different aspects of Judaism. But like back then, do the Pharisees and Sadducees see things differently, like we see kind of the Kabbalah and Musar and Zohar and all that other stuff that they talk about?
The Pharisees and Sadducees were indeed different sects within Judaism, each with distinct beliefs and interpretations of the Torah. The Pharisees emphasized oral tradition and believed in interpretations that adapted the law to everyday life, including beliefs in resurrection and angels. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were more conservative, accepting only the written Torah and rejecting beliefs not explicitly found in it, such as the resurrection. They also had different views on temple practices. Both groups were represented in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, but they often had conflicting perspectives.
Ari, wasn't Nicodemus a Pharisee?
Yes, Nicodemus is described as a Pharisee in the Gospel of John. He is mentioned as a member of the Jewish ruling council who came to speak with Jesus at night. Nicodemus' story is notable because he shows an openness to Jesus' teachings, which is significant given the tensions between Jesus and some other religious leaders of the time.
Let's get back into that Passover. I'm curious about this Passover thing again. Give me an example of what the Passover would have been like in the time of Israel, during the Egyptian time, before the Exodus. Explain to me what the cup would have represented, what the matzah would have represented, the blood, the lentil, the whole 9 yards. And why did they even have a Passover? Why did God instruct him to do it the way he did? And give me an example of what that would look like in their time. Not in our traditional Seder, but in their time. Thanks.
The Passover, or Pesach, during the time of the Exodus was deeply symbolic. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and God instructed them to observe this ritual as part of their imminent liberation. The lamb's blood on the doorposts symbolized protection from the final plague, where the angel of death would pass over those homes. Matzah, or unleavened bread, represented the haste with which they had to leave Egypt, no time for the bread to rise. The bitter herbs recalled the bitterness of slavery. In that time, the Passover was a profound act of faith and obedience. The Israelites were commanded to be ready to leave at a moment's notice, with their loins girded, sandals on, and staffs in hand. It marked the beginning of their journey to freedom and the establishment of their covenant with God. It was not just about physical liberation, but also a spiritual commitment, a remembrance of God's deliverance and a future hope. This celebration laid the foundation for Jewish identity and faith in God's promises.
What did the wine represent in that Kiddush cup?
In the context of Passover, the wine in the Kiddush cup represents joy, freedom, and the sanctification of the holiday. It symbolizes the four expressions of redemption mentioned in Exodus: I will bring out, I will deliver, I will redeem, and I will take. Each cup of wine during the Seder corresponds to these promises of deliverance from slavery in Egypt. Wine, being a symbol of joy and celebration, also represents the transition from slavery to freedom, marking the Israelites' journey from oppression to liberation.
So you're saying that the wine wasn't just used to wash down your food, but the wine was actually very symbolic. And it seems like Hashem had a lot of symbolism going on in this Seder. And it almost seems to me like he was teaching mankind to remember something, because he was performing it over and over and over. And he wanted them to remember throughout the ages what this was.
Absolutely. The symbolism in the Passover ritual was indeed profound. Hashem used these symbols like wine, matzah, and the lamb's blood to create a lasting, tangible reminder of the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt. These elements weren't just ritualistic. They were meant to instill a collective memory and identity, teaching future generations about their history, faith, and the importance of obedience to God. It was a way to keep the story of redemption alive and relevant through the ages.
And it also seems like to me, Hashem chose a people to be the gatekeepers of salvation for the world. And you can't receive salvation except through the Jewish people observing the mitzvot and the 613 laws that they're supposed to observe that Hashem gave to them. And Hashem only gave the Noahides and the other 70 nations only 7 laws to make it easy on them. So if they accept that rule of thumb, in other words, allowing the Jewish people to be the Jewish people as a light of the nations, and then everything else follows suit. And we don't need to be jealous or wanting to take their place. But that is the way Hashem designed it. That's his plan, his rule, his way. And it's only by accepting, I would say in that sense, in other words, harmonizing with his frequency like we talk about, and resonating on his channel or his tone, then we can really find redemption when we do it the way he chose to do it.
That's a profound interpretation, and it reflects a deep respect for the role of the Jewish people in carrying out Hashem's commandments. The idea of the Jewish people as a light unto the nations emphasizes their role in exemplifying and teaching God's laws to the world. For many, accepting this framework means honoring that unique role and finding harmony with God's plan. It's a perspective that highlights mutual respect and the importance of each group's role in the divine plan. This approach fosters unity and understanding, encouraging everyone to resonate with Hashem's intentions.
So I would say when we say, for God so loved the world, and that's a true statement, because he does love the world, he doesn't love just one nation, but he set it up that the Israelites are responsible for all the world, and then all the other nations come under the Israelites.
Yes, that's a beautiful way to put it. The concept of God's love for the entire world underscores the universality of his care and compassion. By entrusting the Israelites with the responsibility of observing and sharing his commandments, it highlights a special role and responsibility. This arrangement reflects a divine plan where each group has a part to play, with the Israelites serving as a conduit for his teachings and blessings to all nations. It emphasizes unity and the collective journey toward redemption.
Now, when I look at the verse, Jesus says that you are the light of the world. I think he was speaking to the Jewish people.
Yes, in the Christian tradition, when Jesus said, "You are the light of the world," he was addressing his followers, many of whom were Jewish. This statement underscores the idea of being a moral and spiritual example to others, much like the concept of the Israelites being a light unto the nations. It's a call to live in a way that reflects divine teachings and spreads light and wisdom to the world.
I appreciate your time, taking the time to speak to me about this. And this is Friday, the beginning of Shabbat. So thank you so much, Ari.
You're very welcome, Bill. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. Shabbat Shalom, and I hope you have a peaceful and meaningful Shabbat.
Shabbat Shalom, Ari.